this brings us to a very fascinating period in human history, I believe, where the coronavirus, Nick, has affected different countries very, very differently. The experience of Italy could be very different to the experience of India or the UK or the US. But the one industry that has been unified during this pandemic has been the media. And it's fascinating that globally the press has been focused on COVID-19, and which is why it's amazing that even here we have people represented from 18 different countries, young students, we have academics, etc. It's fabulous. I think it's a very exciting time to be alive as media persons, which brings me to the first question that we have. Mr. Romel Turakia, if you are here, if you could unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and then ask the question to Professor Nick Couldry.
Hi, I'm Romel, just a friend of the National School of Journalism. You know, that was an extremely riveting talk, like Timothy said. But you know, I couldn't help but wonder this, right? So the topic is media's response to COVID-19 in a way, and it is true that the virus is in the air, and I mean in the air, obviously with a pun. Every publication, be it newspapers, magazines, news reportage, op-eds, whether it's reportage or op-eds, anything, everything is COVID-filled. But has all other news stopped happening? I don't think so. In the meantime, India has attacked a few base camps in Pakistan. Normally that would get like the full, like 3 pages out of the first, out of 10 in the first 3 pages. It was like 2 column inches in on the first page. The US, the Pentagon has declassified videos on UFOs. None of that has got reported. And this is the quality of reportage in the free press, mind you, the press, Professor, you were talking about. And they're not slave to any regime. However free they're slave probably to public consumption patterns. And so my question is just simple. What needs to fundamentally change here? What structural flaws lead to this type of reportage? Perhaps the answer to that is the answer to your unanswered question that you left us all with.
Well, that's a very good point, Roma, a very, very good point. And of course, the brief that I had for doing this talk was to think about the relations to COVID-19. So I focused on that. But as you say, that's what everyone's doing. And that's potentially the danger, that we're not remembering all the other things that continue to go on. I don't, to be honest, think there's a great deal we can do about that in the short term, because in my life, and the life of anyone older than me that I know, there's never been a time like this. This is a situation, although the target is a virus, when the world is consumed in a sort of common struggle one way or the other. And I've never known a time when there is only one news topic. Throughout the 30, 40 pages of The Guardian, this is almost the only topic. Everything is looked at through the lens of COVID-19. And there are worries. That means this is a perfect opportunity to start a war on a small scale, to continue the devastating war in Syria, as you say, to do things on the border in other countries. You're absolutely right there. And somewhere journalists do need to counter that and to resist that. At the same time, I would say that this mass crisis is big enough to actually cast light on the structure of societies, their deeper inequalities, which are normally covered up. So one positive thing going on in Britain is that people are actually celebrating what they call here key workers, people who do very ordinary jobs, low-paid jobs, insecure jobs to get packages around the country and so work in supermarkets and so on, hospital porters. And they're being celebrated now, and the media's played a role in that. So to some degree, the obsession with the crisis has actually turned a light on aspects of society that, everyday aspects of society that are normally forgotten. So I would say that in terms of some aspects of social news, the journalists are doing a good job. In relation to some of the geopolitical issues you mentioned, they're obviously not doing such a good job, and that is a real worry. And you're right, there needs to be a correction at some point. But this is one area, normally I'm a critic of media, but here I wouldn't be so critical in the short term. But I think you're right, an adjustment needs to come.
Oh, thanks so much. That is a great perspective. Back to you, Timothy.
Nick, fascinating answer. And in India, obviously there are different perspectives. And India, and we talked about this a few days ago, India has been gripped by fear. And to the extent that doctors, healthcare workers are being attacked because they fear that somehow, people will contract the virus. Hospitals are being shut down. And travelers are being lynched, assuming that somehow the virus would just kill them. And it's not helped by headlines in the leading newspapers, which, for example, today, the headline is there's a 21% rate of recovery, which is utterly wrong. It's just fact. People just don't have the right understanding. So this brings me to the next question, which is going to be asked by a 17-year-old. So we're quite impressed that she would have a question at that young age. Priyanka Giri, if you're in this call, can you just unmute your mic and ask the question, please?
Hello, sir. Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. My question to you is, in your book, Media Why It Matters, you speak of the importance of media and its role during the era of Nazism and fascism. In the context of COVID, do you think that media has played a similar role in fanning fear?
That's a very good question. And I don't know the details of the situation in India. I'll be honest about that, and I won't want to presume too much by commenting in detail, because I know the situation is very complex and difficult. But I did hear early on that after the government introduced the lockdown measures, there were very quickly some media coverage linked to some members of the BJP or people outside the BJP who were suggesting that Muslims in particular were a danger. There was no medical basis whatsoever for that claim. So when I made the speech that I did talking about witnessing diversity and this fear of the very special injustices that can come when some people are regarded as less important, less human, more dangerous, more risky than others, that's exactly when good journalism has to say no. It has to look at the facts. It has to see, is there any rational, factual basis for that claim? And even if there might be variations in which populations for medical reasons are more at risk, and as we know, there is evidence that Black people may, for reasons linked to certain vitamins, be more exposed to some of the risks of COVID-19, that, of course, is absolutely no reason to give them less respect, to give them less treatment, and so on. So this is a time when journalists have to be very, very clear-sighted as to what their long-term values are. And going back to the broader question of fear, this is a difficult situation because, and I'm speaking personally here, I'm sure we all feel the same, I have been afraid of what this disease means, not just for me, but particularly for my wife, who's more at risk than me. I have spent evenings genuinely fearful for what this means. But that doesn't mean to say that the journalists can stop there. They can't, I think, not present the facts, which are fearful themselves. They are terrifying at certain points. But in presenting the facts, they have to go on challenging interpretations of the facts with more facts. They have to help society go on reflecting about what these genuinely fearful facts should mean for all of us, how it should make us think about the common dangers, which we all share, because as Roma said, this is a danger that is in the air. It's not carried by each of us. It's something passing between us through the basic fact that we're human beings and we share the same air. So we have to come up with common solutions. And that puts a special emphasis, I think, on those two duties of journalists, to present the facts, but always do so with a view to the need for diverse perspectives on those facts, which could come particularly from the people who they might politically be happy not to hear from, to exclude in some way from their political horizon. It's desperately important to be inclusive at this point. So your point about fear is absolutely fundamental. When journalists emphasize fear, they are actually increasing, or they're decreasing the safety for all of us. And they need to think about that as human beings.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful answer. You talked about the huge impact on the loss of advertising revenues to news organizations around the world. So we have an interesting follow-up question to that as it relates to digital media. In particular, I'm going to ask Matilda Ribeiro to ask that question. Matilda, are you there? I'm going to give it 2 seconds. Otherwise, I'm just going to ask her question. Okay. Her question is, do you see paywalls erected by digital media outlets as hindering the free dissemination of information as an essential part of democracy?
Well, it's very difficult. My favorite newspaper is the UK Guardian, which is now a global newspaper and never erected a paywall. And it's now making losses continuously, relying on the generosity of some of its readers. And it's clearly not sustainable in the long run. And yet we desperately need newspapers like the Guardian because of the quality of their investment in journalism. We paid for newspapers for a very long time. The newspapers which are free, the ones that are handed out on buses and trains and so on, are less quality newspapers. So I'm not necessarily against paywalls as such. They just become more difficult in a world where so much information just reaches us for free. So I think we probably, and maybe the COVID-19 crisis is a time to rethink this. We will have to rethink what needs each of us needs to pay to secure the sorts of levels of quality information that a society needs. Whether paywalls are the best way to do it, I'm not sure they are, because so much does literally reach us for free through the internet, or whether we need to think of other ways of subsidizing news production, which are not dependent on the state, because obviously these institutions have to remain independent of the state. That question of how societies, rather than states, subsidize quality journalism, the necessary production of information at a time when the advertising subsidy is falling away, that's a deep social question that we really are only just beginning to answer. But I think what's clear in the COVID-19 crisis is that we have to find answers. We just have to find answers for the safety of humanity. And I think paywalls is just the beginning and probably not the best answer here.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I think just one question. Thank you. We have lots of questions to get through, I'm sure. A related question, I'm going to ask Jaya Mira to articulate it. It's a related question. So Mira, if you're there, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you, sir. So Professor Couldry, what do you view to be the immediate challenge media houses are facing while covering a crisis of this sort as they try to ensure both sensitivity and dignity while reporting truth and also striving to alleviate the spread of fear and anxiety?
Well, it is very difficult. I think the provision of factual information, the range of factual information is vital. So if I take the example of The Guardian, there's so much news right now, one can only select from a certain set of newspapers. I tend to look at The Guardian most closely, which has had a great range of factual information. It's had a great range of voices of people suffering and so on. It's also represented very well the disputes within the scientific community. There are a lot of British scientists who are, for example, very unhappy with the British government's handling of COVID-19 and unhappy with the way the scientific committee advising the government has been acting. And they've been given a chance through The Guardian to express their opinions and involved in debate. And that's been really useful. So I think in any one story, it may be almost impossible to get the balance right. So one has to look at the whole range of production of a newspaper over time and see whether over time they represent a sufficient range of opinions, where facts are disputed, represent the opposite side of the fact, and so on. And I think it's particularly important not just to take the government perspective, not because it's helpful just to immediately distrust everything government says, because governments are doing an extraordinarily difficult job right now. They need people's attention and they need to be listened to seriously. But at the same time, their facts should be challenged, their claims, their assumptions need to be looked at. And crucially as ever, it's essential to hear from journalists about what is not being talked about. To give you an example, in Britain, the figures on deaths on COVID-19 until very recently, in fact, until today, were only covering who was dying in hospitals. But in the past 2 or 3 weeks, we found out that hundreds, thousands of people were dying of COVID-19 in the care homes for elderly people. And these were not being counted by the government because it was inconvenient to count them. Now they're being counted and the figure is dramatically different. That came about through journalistic pressure. So that was a very important campaign for journalists to make. At the same time, they're giving perspectives of what it's like to work in a care home, what it's like to work as a scientist trying to develop a vaccine, and so on and so forth. We need more and more perspectives, more and more facts, more and more contesting of the facts. And this is an ending process. So in a sense, there's no right answer to your question. There never is a perfect balance. There's no one way of dealing with the challenge, but that's the struggle that has to go on. And of course, as we've been saying, journalists need the resources to find out the facts, to go behind the government statement or the corporation statement. They need resources to do that desperately.
That brings us very nicely onto the next question by K.S. Arartik. And after you answer this question, there's a special guest who would ask a question who you may know, Professor Vinod from the University of Hyderabad. So after you answer this question, Vinod, you could get into this group and ask a question, your own questions. So this question is, with several allegations of real case count suppressions by several governments, you mentioned the UK, and obviously China comes to mind, and different countries around the world. Where does the media draw its reliability in terms of factual data to report accurately, especially since public health numbers are in most countries in the world controlled by governments?
That's a very good question. I'm not an expert about the production of these sorts of facts, of course. Maybe you know more about it than me. I think that the only answer we can reasonably give as a society, because let's face it, we don't expect journalists to be health specialists or experts. We may have a health correspondent who knows more about health data than the average journalist. But the sort of questions that need to be asked maybe are relatively simple. We can all imagine the types of places where people die. They can die in a family home, a hospital, a care home, and so on. Are they all being counted? We can also look at the rise in statistics. So, for example, increasingly in Britain, another difference is the government was just giving us deaths per day, but there was no reference point for those to assess those figures. It was only when it started to come out much more slowly from the Office of National Statistics that there was a big difference between the number of deaths this winter and the deaths in previous winters, that it became absolutely clear there was a very major crisis here because people die in every winter. And that came from a different source, from the National Office of National Statistics. So journalists, by seeking out alternative sources, by not just accepting one source, can already do a lot to challenge the government, which would prefer to rely on one source. And then, of course, right now, there is a comparison going on between 20, 30, 40 countries around the world. And journalists are able to make those comparisons if they have the resources to do so. So I think what this is bringing out, and this is where you're getting to, I think, is that this is absolutely a time when we realize the importance of investment in journalism. If the only role a journalist thinks they have is just to repeat the government press release, they're not being a journalist. They're not doing what humanity needs at this time where facts need to be tested. But to challenge the government press release, they need resources. They need time to investigate behind that. They also need the confidence that comes from an institution to challenge what government is saying. And so this underlines the vital importance of resources, journalistic time, the authority of journalists to challenge, to take risks, and so on. All of this drives us back to the fundamental question of why we need institutions for circulation of public information. In other words, why we need journalistic institutions, newspapers and the like, rather than individuals working on their own who will rarely have that authority.
Thank you. Professor Vinod Pavarala.
Hi, Nick. It's so nice to have you in India, even if virtually. It was really disappointing not to have you and Ulysses visit us. I'm really thankful to Timothy for taking the initiative to organize this, and I really hope we'll get you back to India sometime soon physically. But I have a couple of questions, Nick, in response to this wonderful talk. One is a little more sociological. I mean, if you look at the way in which the virus has really pushed us into self-isolation, into a fear psychosis, terms like social distancing that we are using so casually, I'm just wondering whether this is the beginning of some kind of decline of social solidarity within civil society, as each one in fear is fending for oneself. You know, do we lose the ability to work together in social solidarity to address some of the mounting problems that we are all facing together? The second question is much more to do with journalism and journalists. In India, at least, after the crisis, a number of journalists have lost their jobs. A number of organizations in the legacy media, but also on web portals are firing journalists, laying them off. I'm just wondering whether this precarity of job security will finally lead some of our journalists to align themselves much more with the cause of the working classes, the migrant workers. I mean, journalists in India are often accused of being obsessed with celebrities, of being elite-centered. You know, I'm wondering whether their own precarity would now shift focus and make them align to more working class interests. Yeah, so I'll stop there. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Vinod, for those two fascinating questions, and lovely to, I think, to hear you at least, if not to see you. And thanks for all you did to try and get me to India. I'm sure we will do it again. We got very close this time, very, very close. I'm sure it will happen. But great to hear from you. On your first question, there I see. I thought I saw you before, and now I see you. Good to see you. The first question is a very deep one, and of course I don't have a definitive answer. What will happen to social society, sociality? I think the first thing I'd say, and this goes back to the very first question from Roma of why is journalism so obsessed with the coronavirus? And I think one reason is that what is being shaken is the whole social order. It is the whole set of millions of interconnections that hold everything together and give us the feeling we live in a society at all. That is what is at stake right now. that's going to be re-engineered in some way. So we really have to be careful how it's re-engineered, because it could be extremely dangerous if we get the wrong solutions. And there is obviously a real danger of that. So that fear is going on. And you're asking, well, what will people's response be? And there have been some pieces recently, some good ones by journalists saying, will the real danger not be the lockdown restrictions, the laws, but our own psychological sense of fear, that we don't want to go on a plane anymore. We don't want to go into a crowded mosque or a church or a bar or something. And I was thinking about that this morning, and it's possible. And I think depending on whether we or someone very close to us has died or had the virus will make a big difference. But so far, my sense from meeting the people I do in the small village where I live outside Oxford is that people are valuing more their chances when they do meet. They feel a joy of meeting people, of seeing each other, just waving and so on. This means more than it normally does. And they're having more time to think about how life is based on this. So I think it's ambiguous. And of course, wartime is ambiguous. People's sense of camaraderie in wartime is often massively intensified, even as they do brutal things to each other and are very harsh to each other. So I think I'd probably say it's very ambiguous. But of course, it does mean that those possibilities of solidarity have to be highlighted. They have to be brought out by media. And in Britain, there's been some success in bringing out those forms of solidarity, particularly where they've been missing in the past. People just take for granted their packages turn up on time. They don't care. They shout down the phone. Now they know it's a human being who depends on the money from that, and they can see they're taking a risk of physically going out into the world. They understand that differently. I think people probably won't forget that completely. Whether that, at the same time, when the crisis ends, people will be desperate to refer to normality. They'll be terrified of what's happening economically to themselves, their children. So the competition will become even more brutal. So I think it's a very unstable cocktail of things at the moment. And again, it's going to take leadership. It's going to take civil society organizations to see who takes the opportunities, who builds on this or not. So I think it's unstable, radically unstable, and it's very much going to depend on which forces try to take the lead of this. There's no right answer at the moment. There's a lot of potential for bad and good, I think. Your second question about journalism, and it's very depressing to hear of the loss of jobs. I haven't heard the same stories in Britain, except in relation to local newspapers, which have lost all their advertising income, so simply cannot survive right now. They have no economic basis whatsoever. But at the national level, I haven't heard this, and demand for news is up. Will it lead, though, those journalists to become more political? It could do, but again, I think only if new forms of civil society organization emerge. That's what's missing. That's why I deliberately mentioned in my talk community media. I didn't have time to talk in detail about community media, but you will obviously have noticed that. And that was deliberate, because community media are media that seek the truth, that still seek the truth, but coming out of a particular position in society, a particular set of resources and exclusions, and want to tell the truth from there, so that our picture of reality becomes more complex. Now, as people are cut off from each other, they're forced to stay in their own village or their suburb of a town. Everyone is now aware that there is a possibility there are realities that are really massively different from each other. We genuinely don't know what it's like to be someone poorer than us, maybe richer than us, or in a different part of the country where the resource issues are different. We genuinely don't know unless those people have a chance to tell us. And we no longer assume it's just like it is for me, because we know there's no reason to believe that, because we also know no one knows what it's like for us. So I think that is an opportunity for community media right now to say, this is how it is in this part of India or this part of Britain or Sweden, and this is why it's a problem here in this way. So there is an opportunity for community media now, because we desperately all want to hear those new perspectives. That means money, of course, but of course, one of the good things, the good side of the bad side of the undermining of journalism is that it's quite easy to set up a website quickly if there are people who want to follow it. So maybe this is a time, and this is back to Ashish, who introduced the whole talk, to rethink the rationale of community media right now, the implicit subsidy that's there socially in civil society, to encourage community media to come out and to speak for these different experiences and to try and link up with the national media. This could be an opportunity for those journalists who've lost their jobs, as you say, to work in, maybe. Times of crisis are times, of course, when we need new journalism, as they have been for the past 2, 3, 4 centuries. So I think you're right to look ahead there and see this as an opportunity, but it has to be taken. And that requires institutional resources. It requires clear-sighted vision for what has to be done right now, if anything is to be done. So thank you for asking that. It's a great point.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Vinod, for that question. Your books in the past, you have talked about data colonialism. And so we have a question on that by Anuj Raipe.
Thank you, sir.
Hi.
Professor, you touched on the concept of data colonialism in your talk before, and you've also said that it isn't a metaphor, but is soon becoming a reality. In that case, how does our, the millennials or the generation Z, people which is indulgent into handling, restrict or resist the ill effects of data colonialism? What can we do to resist ill effects of the same?
I think the audio was quite bad. Did you get the question?
Thank you, Anu, for your question. I couldn't hear every word you said, but I think I basically got you saying that is data colonialism literally becoming a reality now because of the challenge of this new crisis? And you may have seen a piece that Ulysses Mejias and I published in Al Jazeera English yesterday, arguing something like that. So for those listening in, data colonialism is the idea, the big story of what's happening with data today, the fact that data is being gathered from us all the time through our phones when we're online and so on, is not just about the supercharging of a new capitalism, surveillance capitalism, as Shoshana Zuboff calls it, but that there's something even bigger going on, which is a new stage of human history. As dramatic potentially as the opening of the colonial era originally in 1500, when suddenly the whole world's resources became open for seizure by countries in the West, Spain, Portugal, Britain, Holland, particularly land then, and natural resources, and of course the bodies to work the land. And we argue, Ulysses and I, that this new stage of history that data extraction is making possible is making the whole of human life itself, the stream of human experience, the new open resource for capitalism to exploit through this colonial land grab, which says that's all for us, that is for corporations, that we comply with when we agree to the terms and conditions of every app and platform that we join. So this is a long danger. It's a long-term process that we believe, or we did until recently, will take 10, 20 years to fully unfold. But we argued just this week that the COVID-19 crisis, because of the enormous risks to public health coming from the degree to which all of us are moving around space, is creating a tremendous opportunity for those organizations that do want to grab more data, that do want to know where we are at all times, whether or not there's a health crisis or not. This is a tremendous opportunity for them to shore up their legitimacy with customers, their authority with governments, and their legal rights to grab that data. And some are doing it more carefully than others. The Apple and Google app proposed tries to be very careful about privacy and not giving the data over to government. As we know, I've seen recently that in India, in some states like Karnataka, the local states are being much less careful in gathering data. And the same is true in Russia, Israel, South Korea, and so on. So there are real dangers. And it's not easy to know exactly how we resist something this big. What we say, I suppose, is there are two things that we have to do. First of all, we have to use our imagination. So as in any other time in history when big change is coming, there's one fundamental tool which must always be in play, which is our capacity as human beings to imagine a different future, not to accept the future which seems to be the only one offered to us because it's the only one that certain powerful parties want us to have. We always retain the power to imagine a different future where something different happens because we have challenged the lines of change. So our imagination is the most powerful weapon that all of us have. But of course, it's no good just to imagine things on our own, sitting in our room on our own. Even if perhaps we write a blog, we have to work together. So the second key resource that we've already been talking about is solidarity. We have to help each other imagine the world differently. We have to help each other take steps to become less reliant on certain apps, certain platforms, and so on and so forth. So the practical answer in relation to the proposals of various governments in Britain and elsewhere, and clearly in India too, to say you must have this app on your phone, you must allow your movements to be tracked and so on, so that we can all be safe, is to say, we need to know, is this app going to be effective? Because if it's not going to be effective, why are we doing it? We need to know that it will be safe for our individual privacy and that information cannot be stored elsewhere except on our phones. If not, we need to know why that is being done. And thirdly, we need to know what will happen after the health crisis is over. Why will these apps last any longer than is necessary for public health? Those are the essential questions that have to be asked, and all of us should be asking them together. And this is happening in a number of countries. And I think it's fair to say that if you go back a month ago, it seemed automatic that these apps will be introduced almost everywhere. Now there's more and more doubt. And even President Trump has said that there were constitutional worries about some of these apps, which is something he doesn't normally say. So we have to stick together. We have to use our imaginations. And we, again, must always challenge the messages that are coming from government and counterpose to them other perspectives.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. It's coming to 10 minutes to 8.
Yes.
So I will probably ask a couple of more questions, and then maybe we open it up for 5 or 10 minutes, depending on the amount of time you have. It's been fascinating. So far. I started off by telling you that different countries have had a very different experience of COVID, and in India in particular, if you look at infectious diseases as a whole, India loses every year 1.5 million people every year to infectious diseases like COVID, tuberculosis, dengue, etc. So when you look at it in context of 1.5 million people dying every year to infectious diseases in India, as of now, it doesn't appear that COVID poses as great a threat to India. It's very different from Western Europe or America, and multiple reasons why it could be. Is it, the weather? Is it cross immunity to other coronaviruses? Is it the fact that India is a much younger country? Our average age, the average age is 26 years old. And if you look at Italy, etc., 30% of their population is above 60, whereas in India it's less than 4%. So you have all of these other factors in play. So in that context, Oxford University has come up with a study which said that India had the strictest public policy responses of any country on earth. Now, so a question that quite a few people have asked here is this being used as an opportunity by governments who have a tendency to to fascism, etc., to sort of exert government power and cause gross human rights violations?
Well, from what I've seen, there's some evidence to support that. You know a lot more of the detail than me, so I can't really comment more than you, but I think you raised a really fundamental issue here, which is that it is very striking that this global crisis has so far been overwhelmingly dominated by the news perspectives of the richer countries, starting with China, Korea, and Japan originally, moving across to Europe, United States. We've heard very little from African countries, apart from South Africa, perhaps. There's some news in the general world news from Latin America and so on. But the particular situation you're raising of countries where there is already a very high death rate from very infectious diseases, and that is something that is a battle year on year, not just once in a lifetime, is not coming through in those global news debates at all, to my ears. And clearly it should. That's why we need national journalists. It's not possible for the world, the human need for information to be satisfied by people in some abstract transnational agency who are out of touch with the realities on the ground in particular nations. So you've just given a very powerful case why you need national journalistic institutions. But the question then is, why were those issues not coming through in India more clearly than they did? I remember at the beginning, when your government introduced its first measures, I did see some evidence of some academics challenging it very strongly. But I don't follow the Indian press in as much detail to know whether this was picked up by the rest of the press or not. But what did come through immediately was the cost to migrant populations who depend entirely for their earnings on their movement around the country was enormous, and there was no backup being provided by the government to protect them from the devastating economic loss they were bound to suffer. So this, for me, brings out again this importance of journalists facing every level of the crisis, not just the public health crisis, but the economic crisis, and then the social crisis caused when that economic crisis affects different groups of people in radically different ways. Journalism has to pay attention to all those levels. If it's just paying attention to one level, then it is missing the complexity that it has to pay attention to if humanity is to remain safe as a whole in all its diversity. So I think you raised a very big challenge, and that is an area where voices of community media speaking for migrant population, for example, would have had a very fundamental role to play. I don't know whether they were able to play that role in the national debate in India, but clearly in an ideal journalistic ecology, they would have done. So I think you've just underlined my point, but you've also underlined a point about the continuing asymmetry, the inequality of the global news agenda, and how it remains overwhelmingly dominated by the richest countries and their news priorities. So that it's very hard to hear alternative perspectives coming through, even at a time when every country is listening anxiously to every other country to see what works and what is going on. So you raised a really valid point.
Thank you very much, Nick. That sort of brings us to the, the end of the time we had for this talk. I can't thank you enough on behalf of the NSoJ family for accepting this talk in such short notice and to deliver what I think is a seminal lecture, and to be so open and answer these questions, none of which you had access to before you got on this call. So we are truly grateful to you for your time. And we hope to have the honor of hosting you in person in India soon. We don't know.